Good afternoon, good morning, in fact. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm so used to hosting events in the afternoon. I thought, good afternoon, it's not very inappropriate. Good morning. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Stan Veuger. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'm delighted to host this event on the politics of immigrants. A warm welcome as well to our online viewership and our TV viewership. For our online viewers, please submit your questions to beatrice.lee@aei.org or via Twitter with hashtag AskAEIEcon. Well then, today's election day. Excellent timing for this event. While immigration has played a central role in American political life in recent years, less attention, I think, has been paid to the politics of immigrants themselves. Naturalized citizens and the US-born children of immigrants can vote and run for office. Permanent residents can donate to political campaigns, and immigrants of all stripes, of course, can engage in a variety of non-electoral political activity. And these groups are numerous. About 10% of voters are immigrants, as Mark will explain to us in a little bit. Emily's Cato colleague, Alex Narasti, estimates that some 60 million people in the US are either first-generation immigrants, that is, they were born abroad, or the dependents of first-generation immigrants. Another 25 million or so are second-generation or the dependents of second-generation immigrants. And then, of course, you know, most other US residents are third-generation immigrants or more. Now, how do different groups of immigrants vary in their political beliefs and attitudes? What drives these differences? What role will immigrant communities play today in the midterm elections? Today, our task is to assess what we know about these questions. To do that, we'll hear from our panelists in the conversation, and we'll also take a number of audience questions, both in person and online. And we plan on ending our conversation by 11:30 a.m., if not a bit earlier. With that, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. Daniel Cox is a senior fellow in polling and public opinion here at AEI and the director of the Survey Center on American Life. Ruy Teixeira is a non-resident senior fellow at AEI. Before joining AEI, he was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress for about 20 years, I think, until earlier this year.
Yeah, it was a long time.
And then Emily Ekins, vice president, director of polling at the Cato Institute. And then finally, Hugo Lopez is director of race and ethnicity research at the Pew Research Center. I'm gonna let Mark introduce today's topic. He has a few slides that you should be able to see and that will hopefully magically appear both behind us and in front of us to set the stage a bit for our conversation. Great. Thank you, Mark.
Great, thank you for that introduction. And should I hit the, yeah? Great. So I wanted to share with you some data, some basic data about both how many immigrants there are in the country today, what some projections, at least pre-pandemic, look like, and I want to stress that they're pre-pandemic projections, and a little bit more about how many are eligible to vote, meaning at least adult U.S. citizens, because I think that's an important group to look at, and while not every one of eligible voters will necessarily be registered to vote, it is still important to understand sort of the trends that we're seeing in naturalizations that's leading to a growing number of people who are immigrants and yet also eligible to participate in the nation's elections. Now, I wanted to say a little bit about Pew Research because this will shape some of my comments, which is that we're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. We don't take positions and we don't make recommendations. And so you might hear me talk about some of our findings, but I will I'll be unable to make any recommendations on policy.
Not on polling design either?
I might have to talk to some of my colleagues first, but I can get back to you on that. So, but thank you. So first, how many immigrants are there in the U.S.? Well, prior to the pandemic, we were hitting around 45 to 46 million people born in another country. Immigration to the United States really slowed during the pandemic. So this projection to 78 million by 2065, it's an important projection to keep in mind. In other words, that the U.S. still remains the world's top destination for immigrants. People around the world still are seeking to come to the United States. And in fact, it looks like we're starting to see naturalizations pick up again as people and as the U.S. government begin to reapply or apply for naturalizations, and the U.S. government is accepting applications. Now, the number is interesting, but what's most important is actually the share of the U.S. population that is foreign-born. And you can see here over the course of a couple of several decades that the share of the U.S. population that was born in another country is now approaching 14%. That's important because we're reaching a level that is going to soon be approaching that record 14.8% that we saw in 1890. In fact, we expect that sometime in the 2020s, if trends continue the way we're seeing those trends, we're likely to see the U.S. foreign-born population share reached a new record for the country. Now, compared to some other countries, this is not as high as you see in some other parts of the world. Nonetheless, the U.S. Has seen a growing share of its population that was born in another country since 1965. Many of those who've come to the U.S. since then are people from Latin America and from Asia. It's a very different cohort of immigrants than had been the case prior to World War II. Where do immigrants live? I think this is important to note as well because the story of immigrant geography has really been one of dispersion. So we're going to talk about voters. But what's important here is that immigrants are not necessarily concentrated in just a few places. What's been true about the nation's immigrant story in the last 50 years has been one of growth in just about every corner of the country. And here you can see where there are some concentrations in big cities, but we've also seen growth in some rural areas as well around the nation, in North Carolina, for example, or in Tennessee, or in the Dakotas. And that is important to keep in mind because immigrants are present in just about every corner of the country. So, immigrant eligible voters, what do we know? Well, first, how many immigrants are there eligible to vote? It's about 22.6 million people. This is about half of the nation's foreign-born population in general, but you can see that the number has grown since 2000 from 12 million. So the number of eligible voters has grown and grown sharply. And when you take a look at the share that are foreign-born, you can see that that share has reached 9.5% by 2020, almost 1 in 10. I was going to use some newer data to try to get to 2022, but I'm a little bit worried about the quality of some of the data that is available to tell this story, and we're waiting for some new data from the Census Bureau that I think will address some issues with the 2020 census. Nonetheless, about 1 in 10 of all adult U.S. citizens in the country are immigrants, meaning about 1 in 10 of eligible voters are foreign-born. Where are they? Well, when we last did this analysis, this is the analysis that we found in terms of the state level, in terms of the shares that are highest. California and New York, Florida and Texas and New Jersey have about 1 million each of the number of immigrant eligible voters. And when you take a look at the percent of eligible voters who are immigrants, you can see in some states like California, New York, and New Jersey, about 20% or so, 1 in 5, eligible voters in those states are immigrants. So some concentrations in some specific areas, and perhaps not a surprising list of states and places here, but I think it's still interesting to keep this in mind. Who are these eligible voters? Well, Hispanics make up the single largest group at about 8 million of that 22 million or so. 7.1 million are Asian, 4.6 million white. These are people who are immigrants who identify their race as white, and so mainly European, but they are also naturalized citizens. And 2.2 million black immigrants. These are people, again, who are also naturalized U.S. citizens. What you can see here is that the share white among the immigrant population has declined as the share Asian and Hispanic has grown, particularly the Hispanic share reaching 36% in 2020. So when we take a look at this group, this is a group that's very diverse, people with origins in all parts of the world. The single largest group, by the way, are going to be people from Mexico. They make up about 3.5 million of that 22.5 million or so. But just about every other part of the world is represented as well. So another important distinction to keep in mind. Finally, I want to share with you some findings from our recent survey of Latino immigrants. Now, Latinos and Latino immigrants don't make up all immigrants. So it's important to keep in mind this is not an entire picture of the nation's immigrant eligible voters, let alone immigrant registered voters. I've limited the universe here to Hispanic registered voters, and I want to show you how Hispanic immigrants compare to US-born Hispanics who are registered to vote. And here you can see that, for example, partisanship, that is, in terms of identifying as Democrat or Republican, you see very similar patterns here. 61% of naturalized Hispanic immigrants identify with or lean towards the Democratic Party, according to our August survey. 36% say the same about the Republican Party. Among the US-born, 66% identify as Democrats or lean towards the Democratic Party, and 32% say the same for the Republican Party. Not much of a difference. And when you talk about the congressional vote, in that same survey, we asked people at that time in August, if the election were held today, who would you vote for in the local congressional race? And we found that, for example, again, here, very little difference. 51% of Hispanic naturalized citizens said they would support the Democrat in their race, 23% the Republican, and 17% at the time said they weren't sure or would be supporting another candidate. For the US-born, that was 55%, 26%, and 19% respectively. So again, a very similar pattern here. Now, of course, these numbers are national and broad. They mask findings that if you were to look at different parts of this population, say Cuban Americans or Venezuelans compared to, say, Mexicans, or say compared to others such as Dominicans, you might find very different results in different parts of the country, but that on average, these are the findings that you're seeing across a national sample of Hispanic immigrants. I am going to stop there. You can find our work at pewresearch.org. I look forward to our conversation and to your questions, and you can always reach us here as well. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Mark, thank you. So Emily, I know you too have done surveys with oversampling of immigrants. Does your understanding of the landscape accord more or less with Mark's? And if there are specific issues you think are interesting to share immigrant opinion on, what would those be?
Yes, so to second Mark's point that it's important to realize that immigrants have very diverse backgrounds, come from many different places, have very diverse experiences, and so there's this tendency to assume that immigrants are going to block vote in a particular way. And I think in 2020 we saw that that was not the case. If you compare the margin among Hispanic voters, which are not the same as immigrant voters, but there is a high correlation between either being a first or second generation immigrant, we've been seeing a shrinking of that Democratic margin, the advantage that Democrats have among Hispanic voters from, say, 2016 to 2020, and then even in 2022. I've seen a couple of different surveys have gotten a little bit of different results, but I think the trend is generally that there's this narrowing. And so some people thought, well, maybe that's just in Florida. Maybe that's just from people of a particular set of ancestry and a set of experiences. But that is not what we found. People who have done very detailed precinct level analysis have seen these shifts happen all over the country, in South Texas, in Florida, in New York, in Chicago, in California. And these are people that have very different backgrounds. And so part of what I think we're seeing is a sorting of where immigrants come to the United States and are starting to align their values and their issue priorities with the political party that most closely they believe matches those values and those issue beliefs. And so we're starting to see that happen more and more. A lot of people thought that there was going to be something called block voting, where immigrants would vote in large numbers for one political party going into the future. And we're already seeing that that's not exactly how it's playing out, and that they're very diverse issue positions within different communities. And the other thing that I think is tricky is that people are expecting immigrants, as they start to align their values with issues, salient issues in the United States, they expect them to fit neatly into a Democratic bucket or a Republican bucket. And that just isn't so, especially on issues of criminal justice, immigration. It just doesn't fit neatly. There was a very interesting study that looked specifically at Hispanic voting patterns in the 2020 election. This paper just came out recently. I'm sure it's the Fraga paper. Yeah. And where they see the greatest alignment is on issues of criminal justice and immigration, where there were a lot of Hispanic voters that either turned out for the first time, new voters, and when they did so turned out disproportionately for Republicans, or a shift. Now, even this was concealed by the fact that large majorities were voting for President Biden or for the Democratic candidate in their area, but still the shift was towards the right, and on the issues, the way they linked what was causing that drive, it seemed like the evidence that they had was on criminal justice and immigration. But it's not like it fit neatly within a Republican or a Democratic bucket. On immigration, attitudes about legal immigration tend to, among Hispanic voters, tend to align more with the Democratic Party. But on issues of illegal immigration, there's a little bit more parity between the two parties. And so if you look carefully at some polling in Texas, where the Republican candidate is polling fairly evenly among Hispanic voters with his Democratic challenger, when you ask who do you trust better to handle the border, Hispanic voters in Texas are saying the Republican candidate. And then if you ask, well, do you support a recent policy of transporting migrants to other cities like Martha's Vineyard. You know, Rob DeSantis got a lot of headlines for this. No, the general view was no, they didn't really support that. But they did trust Republicans more on the borders. Like, what's going on? So pollsters dug in a little bit deeper, and they found that a lot of people felt that Republicans were drawing attention to an issue that they cared about. But when you say, do you want more or less immigration, the answer is generally more, which is not in line with a lot of Republican candidates have talked about, right? So how does this all compute? You want more immigration, but you trust Republicans more on the issue of illegal immigration. Well, maybe it has to do with you want more immigration, but there's a widespread perception of chaos at the border right now. You want order at the border. You want to feel like the people that come into the country are vetted and that the whole system is orderly and safe. And that just doesn't seem to fit neatly in either to the Republican or the Democratic buckets. And so I think over these next couple of election cycles, we're going to see a lot of change as people start to connect their values and their issue priorities to what the political parties are saying.
Thank you, Emily. Ruy, I want to go to you next. I know you've recently written a ton about Latino voters, about Hispanic voters, which, of course, includes significant numbers of immigrants and second-generation immigrants. And so what's your sense of whether that group of voters is going? Emily described maybe a bit of a shift toward the Republican Party. And when you talk about that, can you tell us a bit what's your sense of if that shift is happening? Why is it happening? Is it a broader educational realignment? What's going on there?
Yeah, well, I'd certainly echo a lot of the things that Emily said about this issue. My general take on where the Hispanic vote is going, we do know from various data sources that there was this huge decline in the Democratic advantage among Latinos in 2020, probably about 16 points. And everything we've seen since then suggests that margin is continuing to decline. So my guess is that in this election, we might see the Democratic margin among Hispanics and the overall congressional vote only be in the 15 to 20 point range, whereas it was 25 points in the presidential election of 2020, 35 points in 2018 in those congressional elections, this is according to Catalyst data. So something's going on there. The voters are clearly not completely leaving the Democratic Party, but enough of them are that it's really strongly compressing the Democrats' advantage among these voters. And as Emily mentioned, it's not just in South Florida. It's not just in South Texas. It's all over the country. It is in neighborhoods in Chicago and Philadelphia. It's in California. It's in Nevada. We see these double-digit declines everywhere, and we see them also among all the different flavors of Hispanic ethnicities. We see it we see it among Puerto Ricans, who are one of the most loyal of Democratic constituents. We see it in sort of South American ethnicities. We see it among Mexican Americans. It's just everywhere. So something's going on here, and I think it does have a lot to do with people aligning, as Emily says, these voters aligning their issue and value preferences with political parties and not having a presumption that they're going to vote Democratic, even if some of them may still many of them still profess Democrat loyalty, partisan loyalty to the Democratic Party. I think that's clearly going on. So you have moderate to conservative Latinos increasingly aligning their vote, at least, with the Republican Party. I think there was some pooled NBC data that showed that conservative Latinos in the 2012 election favored Obama by like 50 points. And now you look at the congressional data coming into this election, and I think the Republicans have an advantage according to these data. So these are big shifts that are taking place. And some of it has to do with just what would be a normal process of realignment of issues and values with political parties, independent of their initial preferences or their immigrant origin. But also I think it has, importantly, and I've written about this, something to do with the Democratic Party itself, which was a presumptive party for a lot of these immigrants, and how it's evolved over time. It's become much more liberal on a lot of issues about which Hispanics aren't particularly liberal, like crime, like race and gender, like even immigration. I mean, there's some Echelon Insights data that showed if you asked Hispanic voters, what do you think about the situation of the border? Should we make it easier for immigrants to come in, or should we increase border security? They basically split down the middle. So there's a huge chunk of Hispanic voters this sort of reinforced what Emily is saying, who really are concerned with the chaos and disorder at the border, even though they're Hispanics and they sympathize with their compatriots in a sense, and maybe they'd like overall to see more immigration over time. They don't like what's happening at the border. They don't think people should be just pouring across the border in the way in which they seem to be doing. These are citizens, they're working hard, they just don't necessarily identify with that kind of regime. But who does identify with that regime? It's Democratic activists. It's the advocacy groups who are very, very strong on, border security is like almost by definition cruel, and we should just, sort of let everyone seek asylum and so on. And you can go down a number of other issues that Hispanics are concerned about, and I think Democrats have definitely moved far enough to the left on this stuff that it's really alienated a lot of moderate to conservative Hispanic voters. And then you have the economy. I mean, if Democrats are supposed to do anything for these voters, it's supposed to make their life easier, better, for their standard of living to go up. And that is not what's happened under the Biden administration, for better or worse. While they passed a lot of legislation, the bottom line, as opposed to most households, working class households are concerned, and Hispanics are overwhelmingly a working class constituency, is their standard of living is under attack. I mean, real wages have actually gone down because inflation's been so high. We've seen what's happened with gas prices, food prices, and so on. So I think when people thought about why the Hispanic constituency was so pro-democratic, I think one thing that people overlook sometimes is they saw, working class Hispanics saw Democrats as being the party that was on their side. That was going to make their lives better. That was going to provide the services they need, a rising standard of living, and so on, really be in their corner. And I think what's happened recently has called it into question. They no longer necessarily give Democrats an automatic preference on who could improve their standard of living. In fact, if you look at recent polling, Republicans are favored over Democrats on how to deal with inflation, the economy, cost of living, and so on. So all of this is to say that the Democrats' seeming 2-to-1 lock on Hispanic voters is no more. And we shall see where it goes in this election, and we'll see how durable it is, because, just because Hispanics might vote more Republican in this election doesn't mean they'll vote more Republican in every election. I mean, Republicans will more rent these voters, I think, than automatically have them. But, I think it's all to play for. It would be very interesting to see how the data turns out in this election. I'm agog with anticipation to see what the actual trend is.
Mark, you wanted to respond?
I wanted to add a couple of data points that I probably should have mentioned in my talk, which is among Hispanic registered voters, about 1/4 are immigrants. About another 35% or so are the U.S.-born children of immigrant parents. So a significant part of the registered voter pool are immigrants or are foreign-born. Among Asian American registered voters, you're going to find that about half are foreign-born, and that about another 25% or so are the U.S.-born children of immigrant parents. So for Asian Americans, we're talking about a much larger share that are immigrants. But when we've been talking about Hispanic voters generally, not all Latinos are immigrants, and in fact, the foreign-born share among the Hispanic population is in decline across every origin group except Venezuelans, because there's been a growing number coming to the U.S. But even among some of the traditionally groups with a high share that are foreign-born, Guatemalans, Cubans, Salvadorans, all have seen a decline in their foreign-born share. Nonetheless, not all Hispanics are immigrants, not all immigrants are Hispanic.
So Mark, do you see stark cohort differences?
You do. The third and higher generation, which are the U.S.-born people, to parents who were also born in the U.S., they tend to be more conservative and also have stronger points of view about, say, border security, about deportation of immigrants, and so forth.
So that's part of the story we've seen in other ethnic groups, right? It goes back to Emily's
to some extent,
point about
yes.
block voting on some level, right? We don't expect Italian American or Irish American voters to vote as blocks anymore in a way that they may have done.
And we looked at first generation, so people that were foreign born, the children of immigrants, and then the grandchildren of immigrants. And once you get to about the third generation, then attitudes on policy issues looks about the same as people that are fourth and onward, have ancestors that have been here for a while. The second generation is kind of right in the middle. And that's really interesting. I think that's a really interesting population to be looking at. Yeah. I'm sure you are.
Yeah.
And so is part of the story of why, for example, why Ruy was so interested, are some of these voters a little more swingy than the typical voter, or is that not quite true? Is it just that there's large numbers, and so even small movements make a big difference?
I think it's everything that Ruy had been talking about here, and that sometimes you see these movements in one direction or another. Candidates can matter, issues can matter, and the positions of the parties can matter. Our most recent survey of Latino adults found that, for example, they see the Democratic Party as having more concern for them than the Republican Party, but they also don't see much of a difference between the two parties in general. So while the Democrats may have somewhat of an advantage, whatever advantage they had in terms of perception has shifted over the course of the last 10 years.
Dan, not to put you on the spot too much, but I know you're very interested in religion as an aspect of local behavior. And so I think the traditional perception has been that Latino voters are overwhelmingly Catholic. I think that's less true in the U.S. now than it used to be. It's also less true, of course, in Latin America than it used to be. Do you think that change is part of what's driving some of the changes in voting behavior, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what Ruy started getting into when it comes to the changes in the Democratic Party, right? You know, we know that it's become more liberal. There was a time we thought we were seeing asymmetric polarization, that the Republicans were going right and Democrats were sort of mostly moderate left of center. Then over the last 20 or so years, like the Democratic Party has actually shifted pretty significantly to the left. So rank and file Democrats, 50% are now liberal. But the other thing too that I think is sort of playing into this is that the educational profile of Democrats is really, really different. If you look back again in the early 90s, according to Gallup, it's about 1 in 5 of Democrats are college educated. Fast forward to 2021, it's almost half now. And there's a 15, 16-point gap between Republicans and Democrats in terms of just educational attainment, right? So that's one. And then the other thing,
which is true globally almost, right? So that
right. So there's a sorting on education that's happened. It's turned up in polls. The other thing that's happened is a really dramatic transformation in religious affiliation and attendance among Democrats, right? Like we've seen, beginning in the 2000s, a lot of sociologists have noted that liberals and moderates were more likely to disaffiliate, primarily driven by the political advocacy of the Christian right, sort of pushing them out. And so what happened was now you have a Democratic Party that really is significantly different in 3 ways: on ideology, on educational attainment, and religion from a lot of people that vote for Democrats, which is an interesting place to be. And I think you'll see a lot of people sort of chatter about this online, about whether Democratic activists are kind of out of touch with the base. And I think crime is a really good example of where there is that really significant racial divide. So white Democrats, if you ask them about the issue of crime, how concerned were they, their attitudes around policing, they're in a very different place than Hispanic and Black Democrats, who care about the issue a lot more, reflecting their sort of lived experience in the communities that they live in. So yeah, so I think it's really, really interesting to see how that unfolds. I worry a little bit that we're going to overinterpret those results today and in ensuing days. So I think Republicans will have a really good night. I think across all different voter groups, I think they'll do really well, including Hispanics and immigrants. And I think one of the things that is true of all voters, but I think particularly Hispanics, who are cross-pressured on a lot of issues, so they may trust Republicans more on like border security, but Democrats more on healthcare, which is a perennially important issue for that group. So I think there's a lot of sort of practicality in how they look at voting. And I think they gave Trump a lot of credit for opening the country back up, right? So sort of saying, hey, getting us back to normal. And I think there, not all, but I think some number of Hispanic votes that he got in 2020 was due to his response. He got panned a lot by people, talking about, bleach. But I think like on the ground, a lot of people thought that he did a pretty decent job there.
I see.
Yeah, well, I stand ready to overinterpret these election results. I just want
So
to go on record immediately with that.
I know
it's
your guy.
inevitable, so I'm just going to lean into it. But I wanted to pick up on the educational attainment thing that Dan was mentioning. I think that's hugely important. I mean, Hispanic voters as a whole, this is even more true of immigrants, I think, voters are about 3/4 working class or non-college. Eligible voters are more like 4/5. So this is overwhelmingly working class constituency, and all the data that I've seen and some data analysis we did as part of our States of Change project shows that If you look at the shift from 2016 to 2020, where Hispanics did move to the right, is overwhelmingly driven by working class Hispanics. College Hispanics also moved somewhat right, but not nearly as much as the working class Hispanics. And I think we're continuing to see that trend between 2020 and 2022, and it'll be very interesting again to see the data from this election. But it fits with a lot of what Dan's saying about how the Democratic Party itself has changed and how it seems somewhat disconnected to and different from and maybe not quite comfortable for a lot of working class people in general, working class Hispanic people in particular. And it's them who are driving this move to the right. Because I think your median college-educated Hispanic still feels more comfortable with the Democratic Party than your median working-class Hispanic, and I think that's going to be a very important factor going forward.
Excellent. Well, we can talk about how people should interpret incoming election results a little bit later. Mark, I wanted to go back to you for a moment and talk about other immigrant groups, other ethnic groups, some of which are much more heavily immigrant, as you pointed out, than U.S. Latinos. So what do we know about the politics of Asian immigrants, Black immigrants, European immigrants? What, percentage registered voters, party preference, ideology? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so there's been some really good polling done on Asian voters over the years, and you can see that there are some differences by origin groups. So some of the differences by origin groups go along the following lines. Those who are from India tend to lean more towards the Democratic Party than those who say are from Vietnam, who tend to lean more towards the Republican Party. Though across all these groups, Democrats, again, have an advantage in terms of party affiliation. On issues, some polling has shown that
Can you give us a sense of relative size of those groups?
Yes, so when we're talking about, say, the number of Indian immigrants in the U.S., that's maybe about 1.5 million people who are at least foreign-born, and among them, the majority will be a naturalized citizen, about 80% or so. There are other groups as well. There are Filipinos and Chinese Americans, there are Korean Americans, there's Vietnamese Americans. All of these groups are at least about 1 million each in terms of the total size of their immigrant populations. And in terms of eligible voters, as I had showed earlier, Asian Americans are about at 7 million immigrant eligible voters. So it's the second largest group, almost as large as the Hispanic group. Where there's been some fast growth, though, has been in the number of immigrants who say that their race is Black and who are from Africa or from the Caribbean. This is a group that's been growing in numbers and is now making up about 10%, frankly, of the nation's Black population, in addition to about 10% of all immigrant eligible voters. This is a group that in our surveys of Black Americans is distinct in some of its views, and also not so tied to or not less likely to say, for example, that being Black is important to how they see themselves than, say, U.S.-born Black Americans. Now, of course, it depends on how long people have been in the country and where their origins are, whether it's Jamaica or whether it's Nigeria, you might have a different connection. But also, those coming from Africa who are making up the newest and the fastest growing part of the Black immigrant population tend to have college degrees, tend to have actually graduate degrees. And so it is a somewhat distinct population in many ways that is fast growing. On white immigrants,
that kind of change in composition can drive changes in the voting behavior of Black voters overall pretty quickly, right? Just because the existing African American population is so heavily skewed toward the Democratic Party that even that a new group that's 70% Democratic would still be picked up reasonably quickly.
That could be, yes, and that may be what's happening here, although one must still be cautious of who's naturalized, because just because somebody's eligible to naturalize doesn't mean they actually do so. And then, of course, for white immigrants, this is a population that is falling in terms of size and in terms of share, and it's oftentimes a group that is older, so it's a group that might be German or Italian in background, for example, and has been in the U.S. for decades. We have not done research on this, and I think this is actually an important question, an important thing to note, is that when we study these groups, we've been talking about groups and segments, Hispanics, Asians, Black immigrants, and not necessarily immigrants as a whole. It is difficult to conduct a survey of immigrants, given different languages and so forth, and that challenge is something that makes these surveys expensive, which is why we rely on what we can get from other sources.
So is this part, do you think this is part of why Hispanic voters get more attention? Because you can do a survey in English and Spanish, and then
Yeah.
You know, maybe a Central American language here and there if you're really putting effort in.
Yeah.
Whereas if you want to do a survey of Asian immigrants, of course, you have a much wider.
You'd have to do at least 5, maybe 6 languages, but many people, many scholars have been doing regular surveys of Asian Americans. For European immigrants, less so, and for Black immigrants, even less so. So part of it is around the relative newness or presence of a group for a long time, but also the interest of scholars in particular parts of the immigrant population.
Yeah, well, I can tell you as a European immigrant, I've never been surveyed along
As a
these
European
lines.
immigrant.
No,
Yeah.
So I see. So, Ruy, if you had to think about it, so do you think you see similar patterns among non-Latino immigrant communities that you've been talking about among Latinos, or not so much just because for example, shared working class is very different among African immigrants, among Asian immigrants? Is that something you've thought about?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very interesting thing to watch in this election, to see if we do see similar trends. If you looked at the 2020 data, overall, in aggregate, the Asian vote didn't seem to move that much. I mean, it was about as pro-democratic in 2020 as in 2016. However, if you looked sort of more closely at certain immigrant communities in some of the big metros, there did seem to be a move toward Trump. If you look at some congressional districts like in Orange County in California, there were clearly moves toward the Republicans among Asians. And then I think if we look at the data since then, we are seeing evidence of a move toward the Republicans among Asians. And this is more, sort of one can more reasonably say when you look at Asians, you look at the immigrant vote, because so many of them are immigrants. And I think there's an increasing worry among these voters about the Democrats' attitude toward public safety and public disorder, about education. I mean, nothing is more important to Asians and Asian immigrants than education. And the Democrats have now become associated with sort of this leery, sort of meritocracy is somehow quasi-racist, and we should not have these tests in these elite schools and what have you. And I just think to Asian immigrants, this seems like completely crazy. I mean, they want their kids to work hard. They're all tiger moms. They want those kids to get out there and achieve, and they believe that's what America's all about. I mean, if you work hard and you achieve, you should get rewarded. To the extent that Democrats are viewed as somehow not being in favor of that, I think it does very badly with these constituencies. Look, we even saw movements toward the right in New York City among heavily Asian neighborhoods. I mean, big moves toward Trump in 2020, and then big moves. Eric Adams didn't do nearly as well as de Blasio did in heavy Asian neighborhoods in New York City in that election.
In the general, yeah.
So something's going on there. I mean, and I think it'll be very interesting to see, looking not only nationally, but in a lot of heavily, where Asians have a big presence in congressional districts, and in particular races where we can get the data, whether we do start seeing a very significant, obvious shift by Asian American voters.
What races, what districts are we talking about?
What races?
What districts would you?
Well, I would look at the Orange County congressional districts. I think that'll be fascinating. I would also look at the extent we're able to get neighborhood data from, sort of overall congressional and other, various Senate races. I mean, I think that's really, the Asian samples are so poor in a lot of these surveys. We'll be able to look at, AP Vote Norcast, AP Norc Votecast, and the exit polls I'm not so enthusiastic about, but we just want to look at state races, and then you want to drill down to the neighborhoods if the data is available where Asians are heavily concentrated. Look at the high congressional districts. California is going to be a good example, as I said, where they're a very significant part of the population, to see if we can see evidence of those shifts. So it's just a little bit more difficult than for Hispanics to piece together the trend we're seeing among these voters. It's going to take a little bit more work, but I think it's going to be worth doing.
Let's go to Emily then.
May happen.
Just one point here. I think demographically, it's the Asian American population is not, as a group, is not as great fit for the Republican Party as Hispanics. Like if you look at religion, again, Asian Americans are fairly secular. You look at college education, tend to be highly educated. And then culturally, if you look at a lot of, across a range of issues, they tend to be pretty liberal. So I think just that profile, again, is not a great fit. Not to say that you won't see some defections. I think we will around the edges. There's a large and vibrant evangelical Asian community. I think that group is probably pretty Republican at this point. But overall, I think you're going to be talking more at the margins than like widespread changes.
I see. So a little less.
And I also wanted to add too, because you were asking about specific ancestries. So the New York Times after 2020 did a really detailed analysis. I think it was 28,000 precincts, if anyone, correct me if I'm wrong. So very detailed analysis. Now, they don't know how each individual person voted, right? Because you don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know that. But what they did is they looked at precincts, and they looked at precincts that were, like something like 60% and above foreign born, and they looked at the ancestry of where the people living in those districts came from, and they found these shifts to the right in 2020 among Nigerian communities, Mexican, Vietnamese, South Asian, Eastern European, other South American countries, Central American countries, excuse me. So it really was across the board. Now, there wasn't a mention if there was a greater magnitude on average with one particular community versus another, but what struck me was that it was just from very different backgrounds, there were these shifts. And I think one thing we need to keep in mind is that the Democratic Party has a lot more diversity in terms of people who identify as conservative or moderate Democrats, whereas Republicans tend to be like conservative Republicans. There aren't as many like liberal Republicans these days, right? But on the Democratic side, especially among Black Democrats and Latino Democrats, many say that they
there's like Charlie Baker, and he has a 15% approval rating among Republicans.
Oh, there we go. So there's many moderate and conservative Democrats. And so how does that translate when there has been this leftward shift on particular issues of crime, and there was all of that. So I think that's playing a role. And then the other is activation versus persuasion. So one thing that the New York Times looked at was not just, they looked at who were areas that had higher levels of turnout and what percentage of that turnout seemed to benefit Republicans or Democrats. So there was some persuasion, but there was also activation where higher levels of turnout in these precincts were disproportionately favoring Trump in 2020. Right, and so if you look at other survey data where you say, what do you think of the Republican Party? What do you think of the Democratic Party among various subgroups? What really stood out to me is on the Republican question among Hispanic Americans was that 50% had no opinion. A couple of one of these surveys. I'm sure you've seen others. It depends on how the question is worded. But the thing that struck me is that for people who have been activated and they've formed their opinion, and that's about 60-30 Democrat-Republican in terms of who's registered to vote. But there's a lot of people, especially Asian American voters, who have not yet fully kind of connected and felt like they're connected with a particular political party. And right now, I think we're seeing more of that happen today, and issues about crime in the cities, issues about immigration at the border, that is playing an outsized effect. But to Dan's point, I don't know how much of this is kind of ephemeral or lasting. I guess Ruy thinks it's going to be more durable.
Maybe.
Yep.
An unequivocal maybe.
Yeah.
So Dan, something you mentioned that you think among evangelical Asian voters, there's probably a pretty big share of Republican voters now. We got an audience question that fits in nicely here. It says, how has the overturning of Roe v. Wade impacted affiliation mobilization of Hispanic voters? I want to ask that among Asian voters maybe as well. Are foreign-born Hispanics any more liberal or conservative on this issue? Do you know?
We're limited by just like there's not a lot of great data on abortion attitudes among all the different types of immigrant groups, unfortunately. Overall,
and I'm going to keep asking you about increasingly more granular cells.
That's right. So yes, sort of big picture, Asian Americans tend to be pretty pro-choice, much more likely to say abortion should be legal in most cases than Americans overall. Hispanics, they tend to be a little more conservative, with Hispanic Protestants being most conservative, but Hispanic Catholics are a little bit as well. The really interesting things about what's happening with sort of the Hispanic religiosity, and Mark, I'm sure you know all about this, is the shift. There's kind of like a kind of bifurcation going on. So first generation, largely Catholic. Subsequent generations are kind of split between becoming unaffiliated and a little bit more Protestant. So their politics are also moving in different directions too on a whole host of these sort of cultural questions, abortion, same-sex marriage. The unaffiliated Hispanics tend to be more liberal.
And mostly
the
pretty
Protestant
conservative,
Hispanics-
conservative Protestant domination.
Yeah, they tend to be much more conservative on these issues.
Yeah, one thing to pick up on something Emily was just mentioning, and relates a little bit to what Dan's saying in terms of the kind of people who might come into the electorate in a high turnout election. I mean, the people who have, the people likely to be sort of propelled into action in a high turnout election, people generally thought that this would actually benefit the Democrats. It turns out, for example, among Latinos in 2020, it's clear that the peripheral voters who came into the voting pool in that election were actually benefited the Republicans more than the Democrats. We may see that again. We may see that among Asian voters. One thing that's sort of a long-standing finding about non-voters as opposed to voters across constituencies is non-voters tend to be more conservative on social issues. And if we see those voters move into the voting pool, then it actually may, on net, be good for the Republicans as opposed to the Democrats. And I think that, I don't know, when did the New York Times put out that analysis you were alluding to? Was it a week after, 2 weeks after? I mean, it takes them a while to get these things together.
I don't remember.
But I mean, that was really excellent analysis. So I would totally keep your eye out for that as something to help us understand what happens with immigrant voters in general, with Asians and Latinos and so on, and all the different flavors, because that was...
The white precincts, predominantly white precincts, were shifting left.
Right,
So-
right, yeah. Well, especially the more educated
Yeah,
the were,
educated
the
ones.
more left they were shifting. So, I mean, that is, and that gets back to something Dan was saying about how, liberal and educated the Democratic Party is becoming, and how, again, that just does not comport that well with a lot of these immigrant voters and where they're coming from and their economic situation and their sort of values, preferences, and cultural outlook.
And so you mentioned earlier advocacy groups, which are where I think you meant advocacy groups focused on immigration policy in particular, and that there's really appeared a bit of a chasm between maybe the political views they represent and the communities that they sort of offer up as a reward for politicians who follow their policy advice, right? I think that's what's going on. I think there's a conventional wisdom about California that goes in a very different direction, right? Where people really think, okay, Republicans in California in the 1990s became very anti-immigrant, and that made them lose the votes of basically all non-white voters for at least a generation. And so why do you think that conventional wisdom is true? And why do you think the current context is seemingly a little different, where, that same political fight, because immigration has been super salient over the past 5 to 10 years, why is that not producing the same results? What's your thinking of that? Why do you think if any of you have views on this? Because that's what a lot of...
The issues were different. Wasn't it mostly about unauthorized immigrants receiving certain state services, and then it kind of, the rhetoric around it turned into something a lot uglier than that? Whereas right now we're talking more about attitudes about crime, policing, criminal justice, order at the border. Those just seem to be very different issues.
Yeah, I agree with Emily. I think that's right. And I think actually one incorrect read off
But
of
you do have, to push back a little bit, congressional Republicans have proposed reducing legal immigration by half, right? Trump, of course, ran on a Muslim ban, right? It's not just about the border or about crime. So, I don't know. I don't think it's that different.
That's why we all expected the opposite.
Yeah,
we all
exactly.
expected the opposite of what we're saying.
And so you're saying it's not, the same thing is not happening because the issue salience is just different enough that you don't get the same dynamics. Is that?
I mean, perhaps you could say that Democrats overstepped this time. Maybe in California, Republicans overstepped, and this time it went the other direction.
Because even more recently, I think, for example, in Arizona and Nevada, you did see, I think, some immigrant activism that seemed to be working electorally. I don't know. Maybe the National Democratic Party is just very different and things get conflated with criminal justice issues and the like. Maybe that's the explanation. I don't know what the...
Well, I think that there's a way to be really kind of pragmatic and moderate on a lot of these criminal justice issues. We all want police to be held accountable and to follow the law. We all want to have safe cities. We want to be able to feel safe walking down the street. And if one side's going too far and saying we want to not, some might be saying defund, but others might be saying reduce police spending or reallocate police spending into other areas, and then crime is rising, and then there's no adjustment in the rhetoric around these issues of crime, it starts to seem like you're out of touch with the lived experience of people who are having to deal with the costs of rising crime. And so I think in this instance, that kind of seems out of touch. We haven't talked enough about inflation, too. I think that's also playing a role right now. And just bread and butter issues, like if you look at voters in some of these state-based polls, especially states that have been harder hit by the pandemic. Economic issues, voters say matter more to them than issues of like democracy or kind of more kind of social or societal issues that are very important. But many are saying at the end of the day, it's bread and butter issues that
But if
matter
it's
more.
just bread and butter issues and a midterm swing, then Ruy can't overread the results in the way that he wants. He wants to overinterpret. Everything is deep underlying demographic shift. Right? Don't take that away from him. He's very excited.
Well, I mean, definitely don't take that away from me. My God-given right to overinterpretation. But I think what Emily is bringing up and what we're talking about in terms of California is important because it's really the origin story of to some extent of the Democratic misinterpretation of the Hispanic vote. Because they looked at the realignment that took place in California in the 90s and the reaction of the Hispanic and white population to the activities of the California Republican Party and the initiatives that were put on the ballot and concluded, well, what Hispanics are really about is their immigration voters. Since we are the pro-immigrant and pro-immigration party and we want to liberalize immigration laws, we can basically put these voters in our pocket forever. And then when Trump comes along, and it's like, seems to be obviously like anti-immigrant, saying all these weird things. It's like, how could we possibly not totally run the table on this guy? We're going to get 75% of the Hispanic vote. Didn't happen. Then after 4 years of Trump seemingly not too friendly toward immigrants, doing all kinds of things people didn't like, putting kids in cages, saying all kinds of things that seemed actually rather hostile to immigrants, he did way better in immigrant communities and among Hispanic voters. So I think that misinterpretation of Hispanics as sort of being these one-dimensional voters who are really oriented around immigration and which party believes in more immigration, friendly immigration, whatever, has really had a pernicious effect on the Democrats' ability to understand the Hispanic community, what their real concerns are, what sort of what their values are, they're basically Hispanics that are patriotic, hardworking, upwardly mobile people who come to, especially immigrants, come to America to do better. And they're not particularly liberal in the sense that a lot of Democrats are now liberal. If you look at your Pew validated voter sample from 2020, about 1/5, 20% of Hispanic working class, non-college voters would describe themselves as liberal. That's not very many. Democrats, I think, have to get it through their thick heads that these are not particularly liberal voters. They're not immigration voters. They're voters who vote on the basis of their basic cultural outlook and their basic economic situation. And if you're not speaking to that, you're not speaking to them. And sort of just going on about how, the party that's going to liberalize immigration laws and make it easier for people to come across the border or be nice to them or whatever, it's just not enough. It's not enough. I mean, these are voters who do want immigrants treated humanely and fairly, but they also, they want lots of other stuff, and they want some kind of order and security at the border as well. So it's, the complexity of the Hispanic vote, I think, got lost to some extent over time, and I think the origin story is a little bit in what happened in California.
I see. So, yes.
Yeah, so I think there's two, I would agree with what Ruy said there, but this is a group that is quite obviously cross-pressured, right? Like they didn't like some of Trump's policies, like the kids in cages, like that was terrible, then that was not a popular policy, right? But on some of the stuff around the border, yeah, they are really concerned, particularly those living in border communities. So I think that...
Is South Texas where you've seen the largest shift? That must be right.
Yeah.
Among the Tejanos. So I think that's sort of part of what's happening. But I think Mark and I were chatting a little bit before that there's been a pretty significant swings in the Hispanic vote share over the last few elections, and I think we ought to expect that moving forward, where candidates matter, what's the sort of issue that people are focused on, whether it's sort of the pandemic, getting back to normal, to inflation. I think that's going to matter. Policing.
Yeah, I was joking that maybe the whole story is there's just that Hispanic voters didn't like Mitt Romney, and that's the.
Well, right. I think like for voters who don't love either party, and like Pew's data has shown that there's like a record number of Americans hate both parties, right? It's like more than a quarter now. So I think if you don't like either alternative that's presented to you, you may pick one, but like it's probably not the one you're going to pick for here to eternity.
Yeah, that's why I say the Republicans, to the extent they get more Hispanic and immigrant. They're renting. It's just not like they're in their pocket now either. So.
So one thing you would, I think back in a typical block voting setup, right, what you see is that voters vote for candidates from their own ethnic community too. We, of course, South Texas has long had that kind of dynamic. With if you see more of a shift of non-white voters to Republicans, do you feel like are we seeing that on the candidate level too? Is that happening or not quite as much?
This makes me think about Nevada. If we can go talk about some specific races.
Of course, yeah.
And I would certainly love to hear Mark's take, because I'm sure you've gotten into more granular data. But Nevada, the incumbent senator, Cortez Masto, correct? She's the first Latina senator, and she might lose her race to her Republican challenger, Laxalt. And so we've been looking closely at this data, like what's going on in Nevada.
Who's non-Hispanic white? Right.
Yes, he is non-Hispanic white. So her margin among Hispanic voters is, I think, about 48, 38, something like that. So she is there are more Hispanic voters voting for her than not. But
this is averaging across polls, or
roughly.
Sounds
And
about right.
you can correct me if you've seen better data, but I've been looking carefully at Nevada. So one of the some Democratic pollsters on the ground in Nevada were saying, like, really, she needs to be getting like upwards of 60% of the vote among Hispanic voters in Nevada to be for this to be where she wins easily. Right now, it's a toss-up. Like right now, I think 538 actually had her Republican challenger as being, they call it a dead heat, but just like slightly favored to win, like a little bit above 50 out of 100. So it's just like, what's going on there? And I don't have a lot of good answers, and if anyone does, feel free. But one thing that
I think part of it may be that the pandemic hasn't been very easy for the casinos and for the culinary union.
Right, so that's
runs those
definitely true.
elections.
Yeah, so like pandemic, lockdowns and just having to
Inflation,
respond to the pandemic.
Gas prices, inflation, house prices. I mean, it's all worse.
Yeah, so voters in Nevada say they're more concerned about economic issues than voters in Arizona. Like asking the same question, I think this was the New York Times Siena poll that asked the same question in different key Senate or states with key Senate races. And in Nevada, they cared more about kind of bread and butter issues than kind of societal issues, whereas Arizona, it was a little bit more split. But one thing that did stand out to me is that Cortez Masto had been tweeting out about Latinx, Latinx.
Oh, she used the term?
She used the term Latinx.
What fools these mortals be.
Now, Pew polling shows that I think it was at about 3 or 4%
3%
of Latino or Hispanic
adults
in the United States use that term or identify with that term. And so go ahead, you can speak more to this issue because you've done the polling, but that didn't really I was thinking, well, this doesn't really connect. If you're using that word, that's something that I associate more with.
Twitter is for elite discourse.
Right, well, it's,
White liberals on
it's her
Twitter.
staffers.
Knowing your audience.
Her staffers do this stuff. And people who staff Democratic candidates these days are in another universe than your average voter. And I think that's how stuff like this happens. But I'm just surprised. I mean, that's dumb. Even
But it just shows an out-of-touchness that might actually matter.
Yeah.
Mike, what do you think?
I was going to say that after we released our report on Latinx, and by the way, the finding there was we asked Latino adults, have you ever heard of the term Latinx? So no thumbs up or thumbs down, just have you heard of it? And 3/4 at the time, this is in 2019, said they hadn't heard of the term. And among those who had heard of the term, relatively few did use it. And so in total, only 3% of Latino adults in our survey say they use the term to describe their own identity. Now, when we asked those who'd heard of the term what they thought of it, that's when we started to hear, or what it meant, was when we started to hear some real negativity about it. A lot of folks talking about, that doesn't work in Spanish. This is not from Latin America. This is yet another U.S. English speaker attempt to shape the terms that we use to describe ourselves. Others really like it, though, so it's meant to be gender neutral. But again, I want to stress that we didn't say thumbs up or thumbs down on it. We just wanted to ask people if they've heard of the term. Following that, we did an analysis of Twitter to see how congressional representatives use the terms Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx. Now, this is from 2019, 2020, so it's a while ago. But at the time, we found that people, tweets were equally sort of using Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx. So yes, I do think that some congressional staffers use Latinx. perhaps more than the public would. But you also see this sort of balance in terms of the use of the terms. I think congressional representatives trying to reach out to the many different parts of the Hispanic population, because different parts of the population use different terms, and it can get kind of testy in terms of who prefers what. People have some pretty strong views about what they prefer.
Yeah, and if you have a lot of constituents that are college educated, Latinx would be more popular. But if you have a large working class, like non-college educated group, then that would be less popular.
Or maybe not even have heard
If
of
you
it.
look at college-educated liberal staffers of Democratic candidates, I bet it's pretty high, so. Yeah.
So this relates to something that I don't know how you guys think about this in the context of Latino voters. Obviously, there is a public discourse that happens in Spanish on Spanish TV channels, radio. To what extent do you think both the Republican and Democratic Party pay attention to that discourse, to those TV channels? Are there, how much of the political debate takes place in those venues? Is that?
Well, let me turn it around a little bit and say, where do Latinos get their news information, whether English speaking or Spanish speaking? So the biggest sources of information for Latinos are online platforms. So WhatsApp, YouTube particularly, Facebook, TikTok, et cetera. So online platforms are important sources of news, particularly for US-born English-speaking young Latinos, except maybe WhatsApp, which has some very strong Spanish component. Most immigrant Latinos get their news from television. So Univision, Telemundo, they're important sources of news for the Hispanic immigrant population, including Hispanic immigrants. But of course, in some parts of the country, there are very important and long-standing, long-present radio networks, radio stations, and you've probably heard about controversies in South Florida, that have long been focused on, say, a particular origin group, say Cubans, say, or say Mexicans in Los Angeles, and the policy issues around that with a number of talk shows focused on that. It's really interesting to see how the pattern of news consumption for Latinos varies by nativity, but also is different than what you see for the general US public. Television is quite popular as a source of news for immigrants and hasn't really quite slipped, whereas television for the general US public as a source of news is much less a source than it used to be, say, even just 10 years ago. Yeah. So there are some distinct stories.
So we have about half an hour left, and I want to give people in the room the opportunity to ask some questions. I also wanted to ask about a few specific states, anything people should pay attention to, any things you've been surprised by. And so maybe we start out with Florida, which I think a few years ago people really thought of as a swing state. I think DeSantis, who's now the governor, won very marginally in his previous race against a candidate who I think in retrospect was extremely weak. But now looks like he'll win comfortably. In southern Florida, we've seen a couple of districts flip and some local races change dramatically as well. How does that fit into the broader picture? Where do you think that state is going? There's a big Puerto Rican community in central Florida. Is that going to move to the right a little bit as well? I guess what I'm asking is how many congressional seats can Democrats lose there, and to what extent is Florida no longer really a swing state? And what role have immigrants played in those developments? Any thoughts?
I haven't been paying as close attention to Florida because it hasn't been as much of a swing state this cycle. And so that itself, I think, says something, but I should be looking at it because it is very interesting.
Okay, good. Well, we can do some swing states too.
Well, I think I saw a poll, and I don't know if anyone else saw this. It was recent. It may have been like Data for Progress, which is like a left-leaning firm.
It sounds like it.
Someone had DeSantis up with Hispanic statewide, and I think
There's been several polls that have
right. So
showed
that would be like if your plan is to run for president. That's
Florida is a little.
Right. No, it's not necessarily representative of the Hispanic population nationally, but that's a pretty strong signal to sort of send that I am nationally electable. Look how I did in Florida.
Yeah.
And who knows if he's going to run or not? That Trump's going to make an announcement pretty soon, I guess. But again, if he does really well in his election this year and does well with particular groups that are important in a lot of different states, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada. So I think like that would have implications for 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that's well said. I think that I think Florida is kind of interesting in the sense we used to think about it as such a purple state, but recently it hasn't been acting very purple. And it looks like DeSantis is going to win easily, Marco Rubio win easily. And in terms of what Dan was saying, I mean, the Hispanic population of voters just seems to be swinging fairly decisively onto the side of the Democrats. You even see Puerto Ricans in Central Florida moving toward the Democrats, toward the Republicans as they did toward Trump in 2020. So I think this is pretty interesting, right? Because there's lots of reasons why Florida may be ceasing to be really a swing state, but clearly one factor is that this big Hispanic population, and not just the Cubans, are becoming more open to the Republicans, and DeSantis in particular has warmed the heart, apparently, of some of these voters, which is kind of interesting and very counterintuitive, I think, for a lot of Democrats.
I have a question actually for Mark, because I think Florida does raise some questions because Governor DeSantis has taken a very he's had a very well-known policy in terms of how to respond to COVID and lockdowns. Different states have taken different approaches, and Florida's had one approach that has been more, to not keep things as locked down for as long. What polling do we have, if any, that has looked at attitudes towards the policies in response to the pandemic, and are different immigrant populations or Hispanic American or Asian American voters, what do we know about how they have responded to governors taking these different approaches?
At Pew Research, we've done some work looking at the national level of responses to this, and Latinos look like the general public on this. They're somewhat mixed in terms of the different ways in which policies have been pursued in different parts of the country. Clearly, Latinos particularly were concerned about schools because their children, in one of our surveys from last year, many Latino parents said they were worried their children had fallen behind, and their children were more likely to be in a situation where they were working from home, and of course having what the resources that you need, the technology you need to be able to communicate and to connect frequently and reliably is something that many Hispanic families have faced challenges with. So in some respects, Latino parents and Latino adults have been concerned about many of the same things that the general public has, but perhaps more of an emphasis on the impact on their children.
So I wondered to what extent DeSantis' popularity could be somewhat attributed to support for the way he's responded.
Probably has a Surgeon General sending out WhatsApp messages about vaccines. So I wanted to go to a different swing state. Dan, Michigan has probably the only state that has a significant Muslim.
I'm a national pollster, by the way, so
The population.
I'm going to caveat my response.
No, I'm going to make it a national. I wanted to ask a religion question. So Michigan has more Muslim voters, probably as a percentage of the population than most other states. How has that group of voters moved over the past 20 years? I think it used to be pretty Republican in 2000, but then, for obvious reasons, went in the opposite direction. Have you seen a move back there for Republicans? Because there are, I think, quite a few Muslim voters who you'd think of as socially conservative, pretty cross-pressure. What's your sense?
But Muslim voters?
Yeah.
So I actually worked on a poll of Muslim voters at Pew in
Yeah,
2007.
See, I try to ask you questions about stuff you know about.
Yeah, it was. I think one of the reasons we don't have tons of data on some of these communities, it's really, really difficult to do it well. So interviews are conducted in Farsi and Arabic and Urdu along with English. Maybe I'm saying a couple languages. And the project was extraordinarily expensive, done really well. A lot of outside experts were brought in. And you just can't do that every year. So tracking the sort of political trajectory of some of these groups becomes really, really difficult. And then how do you rely on pollsters that are just maybe interviewing in English that are turning out really, really different responses? And I think one of the challenges, and I talk about this a lot, is that we have an abundance of polling now, but the quality of the polling varies pretty significantly. And none of us want to name names, of course. But I
You
think,
should feel free to. If there are specific polls that you think are really low quality.
But I think that's a challenge as a consumer, right? So what can I rely on? I mean, even the exit polling, right? There used to be one exit poll. We would all talk about the results of the exit poll and have debates about what that the interpretation meant for the future of the country and the past election. Now there are like 3 or 4 different versions out there, and a lot of them have pretty significant results. Case in point, the Hispanic vote, I think according to CNN, was like a 30-point Biden gap, Biden advantage. Now Pew's verified voters, I think, had like a 20-point gap. That's a really different story. And so it allows people to sort of pick and choose, kind of a choose your own adventure with data analysis to sort of fit my narrative.
But surely, to some extent, the kind of precinct mapping to ethnicity can help you figure out, at least to some extent, who's doing it right and who's not.
No, for
right?
sure.
So,
That's sort of like when you're doing sort of precinct level analysis, that's you're not reliant on sort of sampling issues and that kind of thing.
yeah.
Can I just add one thing on DeSantis before
Yeah, of
we
course.
leave the good governor? It just sort of jogged my mind when we were talking about it. Yes, there was a poll that came out that not only showed recently, as a Telemundo poll in Florida, that Hispanics backed DeSantis over Chris, but they backed his flights of migrants to Martha's Vineyard. I mean, think about that, right? I mean, that's kind of a, something to chew on. That, the assumption, I think, of your median Democrat, particularly median Democratic activist is, this is like a totally inhumane, awful thing that DeSantis did, and of course, this is just to turn everybody against him. But you actually look at Hispanics in Florida, and they actually backed it by 7 or 8 points. So it's just fascinating to me how these things play out so differently among normie voters than they do among sort of the elites who tend to think.
Big lesson of the last 10 years. People really like trolling, more than I think we would have thought in 2000. All right, let's take some questions from the room. Let's go first here. Please introduce yourself briefly if you can, and then ask a question. And please wait for a mic. There you go.
I'm Jim Robb. I work for Numbers USA. I just wrote a book called Political Migrants, Hispanic Voters on the Move.
You kindly sent a copy to me. Thank you.
Yeah. And it's about the movement and the shift in Hispanic voters, trying to study it. I've quoted most of you. Just 3 data points that were inspired from things you've said. The first, Ekins has done a lot of tremendous work on Hispanic voter attitudes. It's a Democratic firm doing really great research. And in 2020, they did a survey about perceived Trump administrative policies, asking Hispanics about approval. And they found out that there were some really high approval of some of these policies, but reopening the economy got 66% approval. And some other things, like tax cuts were high, and but which is extraneous to the conversation probably here, but more border spending, 55%.
Sorry, what's your question? Sorry.
More border spending, 55%?
Yeah. So that's just a data point. The question is, has anybody done overlaid church attendance to church affiliation and seen how that changed the attitudes on political questions? Because I did that recently with Rasmussen, who polls for us.
Yes, I think Dan, you spoke about this a little bit earlier.
Yeah. So just what outcome are you asking about? So church.
Well, I'm just saying, has anyone overlaid church attendance over church affiliation?
In other words,
to see
less
if
observant versus more observant Catholics.
Right.
And Mark may have some thoughts on this too. Pew obviously does a lot of good work there. So one of the things that we know, and I have some new work coming out on this shortly, is that during the pandemic, a lot of places of worship shuttered. Some slowly opened back up and offered some kind of sort of new approaches. Some did some online stuff, and we know that religious attendance in person plummeted. And I don't think it's back up. Right? The data that we have suggests that roughly maybe 8 or 9 points different between before and after people who never attend now. So you're seeing that actually across traditions too. Although evangelical and members of the LDS Church, those folks seem to have rebounded more than other traditions. So yeah, and I think it will certainly
Which is
have
surprising.
Downstream effects.
Catholicism requires in-person action, so you would think that would
Right.
rebound faster.
Although, yeah, if you look at even before the pandemic, Catholics had lower rates.
It's also a broader notion of what.
Than Protestantism, yeah.
All right, let's go to the back up there.
Stanley Kober. I'd like to approach the politics of immigration from a different point of view. As a child of immigrants growing up in the United States, I did not have a sense of any discrimination that I was second class or anything. That's changed. I associate walls with the Soviet Union. Remember President Reagan? Tear down this wall. I never thought I'd see an American president proclaim, build that wall, and be cheered. And it's not just the physical walls, it's the psychological walls that underline it. What has changed in the United States in our attitude? When the Berlin Wall came down, I don't know that anybody saw this coming. I know I didn't. What has changed?
So I'm interested. Chuck Grassley, I think, praised the Iron Curtain last week. So I think that there's something to that's definitely a dramatic shift from I think where he was in the '80s. What do you guys think? Why do you think the border politics have changed? Is it just that travel is
Can we bring
more
back
feasible?
graphs? Can
Sorry.
we bring back your graphs at all?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
There's a
no,
graph that
I was just
think-
going to say that we've done some experiments in the past that asked about a variety of different immigration attitudes, and one of the things that we did, we inserted a statement that just, this, according to the census, by 2042 or whatever it was at the time, the majority of the country's going to be non-white. And that we saw that sort of just priming people with that information, that sort of significant demographic change over the next few decades, like prime people to have, we interpret it as having more negative attitudes towards immigrants. So our interpretation of that survey experiment was that, when you prime people to be concerned about the significant amount of demographic, not to mention cultural change the country is experiencing, their attitudes shift a little bit more negative to immigrants, more supporting of the border, funding the border wall and deportation.
And so your brief answer is that, no, I don't want to guess your age, but that in the 1980s there had been less of that kind of demographic change, and so the politics around immigration were less contentious as a result.
It was certainly less salient too, right? You didn't have Tucker Carlson, you didn't have people sort of talking about these ideas, right, like pretty regularly.
Yeah, and perhaps having the geopolitical enemy build walls also helped in making walls less attractive. Who knows? All right, let's do.
I was going to respond.
Oh,
Can
sorry.
We go back
Sorry,
one
let's slide back
slide?
up. Yes.
The percentage were important. Yeah. So in the 1850s, there was a movement, the Know Nothings. There was a movement that was anti-immigrant, and look about 1850s, 1860s. There was kind of an anti-immigrant backlash. And if you kind of compare the percentage of the population that was foreign-born then kind of compared to where we are now, I think a lot of this has to do with just the fast-paced change. And in when Ronald Reagan and George Bush in one of those famous debates, they're competing for who could be the most pro-immigration president. If you recall this, was this what year was this? 80s? I don't know. 80s? Right.
Yeah. So that's when we're around 7% or something.
The U.S. hadn't experienced a lot of fast-paced change at that time. And so I think after the U.S. experienced that fast-paced change, that's when you get this backlash. So I think it's kind of about the pace of change. But once you're there, people assimilate very quickly. There's some really interesting data from a professor at Harvard, Ryan Enos, where he did this really cool experiment where he actually placed, I think, Spanish speakers as part of an experiment in subways across Boston. And then I actually don't even know how he did it, but he figured out a way to survey people that took the subway, the T, and found that at first, when he first placed these Spanish speakers that were part of the experiment in all these subway stations, that anti-immigrant sentiment went up at first. And then over a couple of months, he kept surveying, and then he found that attitudes became more favorable. And the people that were part of his experiments even said that at first they felt like people weren't very friendly to them, but then over time people started recognizing them and talking to them, and then it became whatever he had measured as this kind of backlash effect went away. But I think that's kind of a microcosm of what we see at the national level when at first there's a fast-paced change, there's this backlash to it, but that over time people become accustomed to it and they become friends, family, and kind of everyone gets acclimated.
And it is a weird, nuanced story, of course, because the highest immigration share parts of the country are typically also the most pro-immigrant, right? It's not, the backlash is not local, right? So it really
No,
is.
there's more than that, because there's also sorting, self-sorting, where people who prefer greater homogeneity move to places that are homogeneous. And that in 2016, a really interesting congressional district level analysis found that congressional districts that experienced the fastest amount of demographic change did experience a pro-Trump shift from 2012. It wasn't about the level, though. This is key. It's not about the percentage foreign-born. It was about the percentage change in the foreign-born. Does that make sense? And so what it is, it's about how people respond to a change, not the way things are once they become accustomed to that change.
I thought we'd done housing policy so that no one ever moves anymore, and there's no room for sorting.
Yeah, Dan Hopkins at UPenn found basically the same thing in this article, I think called Politicized Places, where it was the dramatic influx of new immigrants what resulted in a shift in attitudes. It wasn't just people with places with sort of higher diversity or a higher number of immigrants.
So I guess the implication of what Emily is saying from that experiment is that as the rate of increase levels off, and they've been there for a while, attitudes may in fact become more friendly.
Yeah. Which is, I think, also the broader historical picture you were trying to paint, right? That you have this uptick, backlash, gradual readoption, then you get that Bush-Reagan.
And I'd add intermarriage to that as well.
Yes.
So let me let me quickly ask one question from the internet for all of you. Is there any indicator that survey non-response from immigrants has increased since Trump's attempts to put a citizenship question on the 2020 census? I don't know, that seems like a hard question to answer, but what effect would this have on the quality of polling? Well, if there's this new non-response, surely it would make the quality of the polling worse, but have you seen anything like that? Greater non-response for people who are either non-citizens or who may be more concerned about immigration enforcement?
Certainly in the decennial census, the Census Bureau is concerned about who might and might not have been counted. But of course, the complication there is that Trump proposed this. There was a lot of news coverage about having a citizenship question on the census form, and it was not implemented. Yet we also had COVID, and we're also doing this for the first time the census was available to do online. So all these changes make it hard to tell what really happened. But we did have a 5% undercount of the nation's Hispanic population. If you just think about it, it's even...
And that's different from 2010?
From 2010, it was maybe a 2%. This was the biggest undercount we've ever had of the Latino population. I would say, though, that as a pollster, this has always been a concern, that you have how you ask questions and when you ask them. So if you ask somebody if they're a U.S. citizen, especially a group that has many people who might be undocumented, you might lose people who are participating in your survey. So this was already a problem beforehand. Has it gotten worse? I don't know.
Thank you, Stan. Thanks to all the panelists. I'm going to try to wrap up an overarching theme that we've heard here, and just get your all reactions, if that's okay, to make sure that I'm accurate. But for a long time, we've heard Mario Lopez, by the way, Hispanic Leadership Fund. For a long time, we've heard this narrative that immigrants are a drain on the economy, that they're going to take jobs, that they're going to do, they're all on welfare, all these terrible things coming largely from the Tanton Network and other anti-immigrant organizations. And central to that theme was the political argument. More Hispanics equals more Democrats. And that's what they've been trying to push on Republican elected officials especially. Now, you all are saying it's more complicated than that, essentially. And I wonder if that's a fair conclusion to make. Open to anyone on the panel.
Certainly the opinions and the politics of immigrant populations, I think, vary a lot across those origin groups. I think we started out today talking about, is there really a group called immigrant voters? I don't know. I think we need more polling to really understand. But in the case of Latinos, the stories about different immigrant groups based on their origin countries quite sharply. And even within some of them, there are some differences because the Mexican population is so large that when you take a look at both those who are U.S. born and those born in Mexico, and when they arrived, in the case of Cubans, that could make some big differences in opinions and views and whether or not people even choose to vote in an election. So I do think it's a complicated story. I don't think there's a simple summary here, and I would encourage folks to think about the diversity of the nation's immigrant population, which will translate into a diversity of politics and political views.
Let's go over here, please.
Hey, thanks for a great conversation. How do you think that the way that we talk about race, the vocabulary that we use, is going to change as there are more immigrants in the coming decades? So one of the points that Mark made that was really interesting, there's a distinction between how Black immigrants and native-born African Americans sort of perceive themselves as Black, right? Mexico doesn't track race, the cultural context is different, so as people from different contexts talk differently about race, how is that going to change, I guess, how pollsters talk about race, but also how we, in general, talk about it?
That's a really good question. And it's something that's been on my mind as I think about the results of the 2020 census and some of the work that we've done at the Pew Research Center. Recently, we did a report looking at different ways of asking, for example, Latinos about their racial identity. Census Bureau way is just one of many ways. It's really shaped the way a lot of people think about things, so keep that in mind as I share with you these results. So first, in terms of the Census Bureau format, we found more than half of Latino adults say that they're white in a traditional question on racial identity. Very few say they're Black, very few say they're indigenous, very few say they are Asian. It's really white, or what's called some other race, where people write in that they're Hispanic or Latino or even their origin country. The second question we asked was an open end. Just tell me what's your racial or ethnic identity. The Census Bureau form has so shaped the way people think about it. People are like, people will say, I think I'm supposed to say I'm white here. So you see these responses that don't quite mirror the census form, because you do get many more providing their Hispanic or Latino origins in that answer than you would otherwise. But that was the second way approach we took. A third approach is something that you see some scholars have been using as an alternative to you self-reporting your race, instead asking, what do you think others would think your race is if they walked past you on the street? And there we found that the majority of Latinos, whether immigrants or not, and I'm talking about 70% plus, will say that, oh, people are going to think I'm Hispanic or Latino if they see me walking down the street. The final question was, number 4, was what is your skin color? And the reason why we asked about this is because skin color is something that many people from Latin America identify as a challenge, that they are discriminated on based on their skin color when it comes to opportunity. That has nothing to do with the Census Bureau's approach, but it is an approach that was very interesting in the survey, because it did show that darker-skinned Latinos are more likely than lighter-skinned Latinos, even if they're self-reporting their skin color, to say they've experienced discrimination on a whole host of issues that we measured. There's other ways to approach this. We've been talking about origin groups. Maybe we should be talking just directly about different racial identities that are not part of the Census Bureau's format. And that might be, for example, are you Afro-Latino or not? Interestingly, we asked this of the general U.S. public, not just Latinos, but all U.S. adults. And we found that about 2% of all U.S. adults say that they are Afro-Latino. That translates to about 6 million people, if you were to take that estimate and just multiply it out. But here's the interesting part. Not all people who said they're Afro-Latino also say they're Hispanic or Latino. So the majority, 80%, say, yeah, I'm Hispanic as well or Latino as well. But about 20% said, no, I'm not. So it's about 800,000 people or so who say, I'm Afro-Latino, but I don't self-identify as Latino or Hispanic, which I think is an interesting approach. Again, pointing out that the Census Bureau's approach is just one of many, and there may be different ways that we need to talk about racial identity. Here's one last point. Now you got me going, so I'm sorry. Which is, even if we were to use the Census Bureau's approach, which I think is very powerful because there's a lot of good data there, and it's what most people use, it's what most government agencies use, it's the approach that's used by most, so let's stick with that. Do we talk about groups as we have been talking about them here, Hispanics versus single-race non-Hispanic whites versus single-race non-Hispanic Blacks versus single-race non-Hispanic Asians, and then everybody else, right? Or 2 or more races, and then maybe there's some other groups, but it's all mutually exclusive categories. People don't think about themselves in that way. People say, well, you know, I'm both white and black, and I'm also Hispanic. So we have to, I think, shift the way that we think about reporting these numbers. And in the parlance of the Census Bureau, we should be talking about race alone or in combination. That is, to capture the many different ways that people have reported these numbers to us. And you'll see that the Census Bureau's 2020 reports actually show exactly these tabulations. So I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you, Mark. We're done here. Thank you very much to our panelists. I know you can go for another 45 minutes. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your questions.
Yeah,
Round of applause for our esteemed panelists, please.